Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. There's always a few stragglers, especially when we're sharing the elevators with GW students, but welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Mines. I'm a research fellow here at the program on extremism at GW. We're really thrilled to put on today's event, Jihadism in the West, Current Trends, with our partners at the National Counterterrorism Innovation Technology and Education Center, or NSITE for short. NSITE is a Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence. We're very grateful for their support and their funding, which has helped to support much of the work that we've done here over the last few years, in part the research that will be presented here today. So we're grateful that we can be here with them. I want to thank, as well, those who can't join us here today. Realize it's a Monday, it's also a holiday, so Happy New Year to those who are celebrating. And if you're not able to join us and you're watching this recording later, we can see you at our next event, and thanks for watching. Just a few housekeeping notes from me. You have in front of you some flyers, or if you don't, I'm sure your neighbors do. On those are a few QR codes. You can find out more about today's event. You can find out more about NSITE, and you can find out more about the publication platform that has featured many of the reports, including those that will be featured here today, the research that will be the conversation of much of today's discussion. So that third QR code, Nexus, is a platform we've released just this year and highly encourage you to check it out. There have been some major developments just this year alone. Last August, of course, Kabul fell to the Taliban, and they now mark their second time in power. The removal of the leaders of both the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda this year alone marks two of some of the most major milestone events in both organizations' histories, which are now decades long. And worldwide, we're seeing a surge in jihadist activities in multiple theaters, especially in the African continent, much of which is concerning for intelligence agencies, defense agencies, and so on. But both abroad and here in the West, we're seeing a jihadist movement that is largely in transition, that is struggling with some of its own challenges, just as our societies are struggling with challenges of our own. And so that presents a number of opportunities, but also a number of challenges as well. So that will be the conversation that we're hoping to have here today with you. I'd like to introduce to you our speakers, Dr. Gina Ligon, who is the director of NSITE, a good friend of the program, and whose work on jihadist organizations, terrorist organizations, their structures, their leadership is known worldwide, and so we're lucky for her contributions today. Next to her is the director of the program, Dr. Lorenzo Bedino, whose work on really all things jihadism in the West is celebrated and respected, and so we're looking forward to his comments. To his left is Adrian Shuni, whose work on the Western Balkans, whether it be PCVE or CT reintegration policies, rehabilitation policies, and other work related to the security sector is very important and crucial, especially at the time we're currently facing. And then to his left is Dr. Hugo Micheron, who we're excited to welcome as a visiting research fellow this fall at the program, and whose work on jihadism in Europe, and in particular, jihadism for the French-speaking landscape in Europe, is well respected and has made some quite valuable contributions over the last few months and few years especially. So that's enough for me. We'll have time for a Q&A at the end, so I encourage you to keep your questions until the end. I ask you to be mindful of today's panelists and today's audience members, your fellow audience members as well. We will get to you at the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gina. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone. So there's an emerging threat that keeps me up at night as someone who has studied the development of terrorist leaders, and that is the impacts of prisonization on the 239 plus individuals who've been charged with supporting ISIS in America over the past 8 years. So the data produced by GW's Program on Extremism have really raised the alarm to those of us at NSITE who look at emerging threats. I flew in from Omaha to raise the alarm to you all here today. I'm really grateful for this platform and to be on this panel with these wonderful experts. So my name is Gina Ligon. I'm the director of NSITE. By training, I'm an organizational psychologist, and so what I've studied is the developmental events that make terrorist leaders lethal. And so when I look at prisonization and what's happening in the United States and the West in general, but I'm going to focus my comments on the US, it does raise some alarms for me. So for my brief time today, I wanted to just introduce what prisonization looks like for these ISIS in America inmates in the United States, from the pretrial to what happens when they're in, and then what's happening when they get out. The work that GW, Program on Extremism, has put in to identify the nature of these individuals, the nature of their crimes, and the nature of what they're capable of is incredible. And I'd encourage all of you to look at some of their recent reports on ISIS in America that were just released last week to try to understand what's coming next. So first, let's talk about what happens when they get in. So according to Program on Extremism, between 2014 and 2020, there have been 221 individuals who were charged with ISIS-related offenses. Now, in the last 2 years, between 2020 and 2022, that number's dropped off. It's gone to about 29. Sentencing averages 13.3 years, with the shortest being no time in prison, but actual 5 years of supervised release, and the longest being Corey Johnson, who was associated with the stabbings at the sleepover in Florida. He got life in prison. So there's a lot of variability about the kinds of prisonization experiences these individuals have. The 3 types of activities they're usually charged with are going to be travel, attack planning, or actually executing the attack, and then other types of material support. So some of the more recent cases have been hosting really sophisticated websites that have different recruitment material and propaganda. There's a really great 2021 article in Studies of Conflict and Terrorism by Rafael Marquez, and he looked at the sort of recidivism rates of the individuals who had been charged between 2014 and 2020 in general, and he found that 31% of them had been arrested at least 3 times. And what's interesting, when you look at the 29 who you all just released a report about, their prison experiences are incredibly violent. Their charges that they had, a lot of domestic abuse. So the people who were willing to actually support or try to travel for ISIS in the last 2 years look a little bit different. They look like more hardened criminals from the U.S. And so to me, that poses some threats as well. So upon entering the prison system, what happens is they're giving a risk assessment. It's called the PICRA. And the PICRA is what's used for all types of risk assessment for all types of offenders. And so it's interesting because if you look at the items on that, they are really looking at risk for future violent crimes. And so it's difficult to imagine a kid who was making a pressure cooker in his mom's house as scoring high on that. In fact, some of the results have showed that these individuals score lower than other types of violent extremists like RIMV or agave extremists who look more like typical criminals. So these risk assessments may not be picking up what a violent extremist's risk actually is. So what's happening when they get in prison and how might this impact them? So given the majority are charged with supporting a foreign terrorist organization, these individuals are now in the federal prison system. And so most of them are going to be in Supermax, either in Florence, Colorado or Terre Haute, Indiana. And they have different experiences based on what their risk assessment score was. So there's 3 kind of models that we use for determining what the experiences are of inmates in prison just internationally. For a lot of places who are more well-versed with dealing with extremists, they use a model called containment, which is they separate them from the general population so they can't radicalize others. The second is something called dispersal, and this is sort of this awareness that they've got to just mix them in with the general population. The one that America uses is sort of a mixed approach, and so they decide based on their risk assessment scores if they are going to be in containment in Supermax or if they're going to be mixed with the general population. So there's some consequences to that, right? When they are in containment, which is what we might think, oh, that's the way we should do it, right? Like that sounds good. Let's keep them away from the general prison population. It's costly. It also gives them a really interesting credibility, because there's a stigma that goes along with being in this sort of highly supervised area. So when you get out, you are sort of thought as the worst of the worst if you do get mixed in. And it has the potential to solidify bonds between individuals who were in that sort of heightened supervision phase. So it's not necessarily the best way forward. So the mixed approach is supposed to be tailored to individuals' risk for violence going forward. It's difficult to draw comparisons to jihadis in prisons outside of the U.S. because the U.S. prison system is more ordered, right, than a lot of prisons that we know a lot about. And so it's hard to draw some comparisons, but I've spent my career looking at prison experiences as they predict lethality in terrorist leaders. And so what's interesting to me is that prison experiences are prevalent in about 50% of the leaders that I've studied, and I've studied leaders of every foreign terrorist organization that has been active between 1985 to present. And so when you look at that and you look at why prison is such a formative life event for these individuals, there's two different types of roles that they play. One, when these individuals are in prison, they're granted sometimes this sort of religious authority, and I'm just describing my comments to jihadists in prison right now. And what that means is they're asked to lead sermons. They're kind of different from the traditional prison mosques that are sort of granted authority by the prison officials. Or the second way they gain influence is that they can, because they've been there for a long time, they can become hardened criminals who actually have a lot of awareness and knowledge of how to stay safe in prison. And so that sort of pragmatic expertise also gives them a lot of authority once they're in prison, and they can have exchange relationships with that. So a great example in the US would be Mohammed Ahmed, who is now serving a sentence. He's set to be released in 2039, but before that, he was said to be radicalizing a lot of individuals in the US prison system based on that second category, that he wasn't necessarily a religious leader, but he had a lot of credibility because he had served for a long time. He had also studied with Al-Qaeda in the 90s, and he also studied with Al-Shabaab. And so you have this individual who's sort of a celebrity in the prison system, and before he was contained, he was mixing with other types of inmates and encouraging them to travel upon getting released. So not all individuals in that prison system are going to be leaders, and I do want to acknowledge that, but if you look at a lot of the propaganda, the Salafi jihadist propaganda about time in prison, if they have spent it once they get out, they are then sort of given this street cred, right? That they did time for the cause. And so that reverence from propaganda can actually have them have more credibility upon release. So they may not be leaders before they go in or when they're in, but once they're released, they're seen differently than other people who were part of the global jihad before. And then there's the other piece that we know as criminologists, is that social learning theory, that just being around other types of criminals exposes them to other ways to be smarter about committing crimes in the future. Clark Calloway is a great example of that. He served time with the Fort Dix Six and wasn't separated from them, and then learned a lot about what he was going to do to plan some attacks in the DC area. So finally, what will be the impact of their release on society? Dozens are currently under supervision right now. They've already been released, so this is not a down the road problem. This is right now an immediate problem that we have in the United States. I do want to acknowledge that prison can be rehabilitative for some people, but let's be honest, the intent of prison is actually to punish and for people to serve their time to society. And so there's no real clear understanding if these individuals will be rehabilitated once they're released. There's other high-risk inmates like sex offenders who are a very large population. There's about 800,000 convicted sex offenders that we've invested a great deal in to try to help them re-enter society. We have not put the same resourcing into extremists. It makes sense, right? We're not going to overhaul the criminal justice system for 200 plus individuals. However, I think there are some things that we as a research community could be doing. One of the things from the federal prison system is that they're looking to us for recommendations, scientific recommendations about what the right de-radicalization programming looks like, what supervised release works in other countries. That's why I'm so excited to hear from my panelists, because they've spent a lot of time working on this. We don't have that kind of data in the US with this population. And so it's a call to action for researchers to try to help them, to guide them, to give them some evidence about what works and what could be implemented in the US prison system. Because right now, when they're released under supervision, it's not clear that the individuals who've been charged are actually going to have the supports they need to re-enter society from a couple of standpoints. One, the rarity of the cases, right? So the supervisory officers may only see one their whole career who's been a jihadist, and they may not have the training or understand what they need to do to actually make sure this person's successful at re-entering society. Number two, the supports that are out there, everyone talks about the shortage of licensed clinical social workers. But in addition to that, there's no specific training for licensed clinical social workers as it relates to radicalization and de-radicalization. And so when we think about the licensure exams, the training that are happening in our academic institutions, there's a huge call for action about how can we help these individuals who are in positions to help support people re-entering society to know what the right tools and best practices are. Finally, just to end, we are working on a couple projects at Insight that I'm also calling if anyone's interested in this topic that you might want to get involved in. One is we are working on a handbook for supervisory officers in the federal prison system and possibly state prison system about what the best practices for management of these individuals are. We're compiling our list of subject matter experts. We want to hear from international experts as well. And we have a vehicle to be able to fund people to work on this project to support these people who are charged with managing their release. And then the second is we have an expert system that we're designing. We really see when you have like these rare kind of base rate instances, we see it as an opportunity for some technology to for an expert decision system so that we can put the right resources in the hands of people who are charged with helping these individuals once they get back into society. So we just filed a provisional patent last week for that and working on SME expert system about how to manage individuals who are integrating back into society. So, just to close, I'm very excited about being here. It's a very important topic. For me, hearing from my international experts on the panel to understand what we in the United States can learn from you all is a great opportunity, and I'm excited for discussion at the end of this panel. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Gina. We had slated Hugo to go next, but we can work down the line. All right, Hugo, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for having me. I'm delighted to be among such great panelists. It's my first day here at the program. I just finished a two-year postdoc at Princeton University. My name is Hugo Michon, and I'm specialized on European jihadism. I've been working for the past 8 years on French and West European jihadism. I've been conducting interviews in the French prison system and meeting with about 80 returnees from Syria and Iraq and French sentenced for their relation to the ISIS project in Europe. And I'm currently finishing a history of the European jihadist phenomenon, mostly working on 8 specific countries, which basically made up for 90% of the European contingent in Syria. And I will start by this. It is very important to understand that even though ISIS has been physically destroyed in Syria and Iraq, and there is still some shreds there that are quite active, but let's say as a so-called caliphate has been destroyed, jihadism as an idea, as an ideology, is still very much present, and arguably the challenge that lies ahead is bigger than ever, especially in Europe. I'll take just like a few figures for you to picture the situation. The roots of European jihadism can be traced back to the 1990s, right? When veterans from the Afghan war and from the Algerian civil war like settled in Europe and started like organized clusters and then spread the ideology in their closed environments. At the time, we're talking about dozens of Europeans involved in jihadi organization and circles. 20 years after that, when ISIS was at its peak in Syria and Iraq, we're talking about 6,000 European citizens involved with the organization. It means that we multiplied the phenomenon by 100-fold. I'm not sure there is, other political stakes that have been developing as fast as this one over the past 20 years. This means as well that we reach a threshold now in Europe, because it's not only that the volume are higher, it also means that the phenomenon is different on a qualitative point of view, because now we have not only male who are fighters, but actually female involved, and Europe actually provided quite a big contingent of female militant to ISIS. We also have minors and underage kids, and of course this is a pressuring issue for Europe, because we see it with what is happening now in the camp in northeast Syria. What we do with a 10-year-old who is now detained in a camp in northeast Syria and who has been exposed to ISIS propaganda since his young age. So that's one thing. I think this is very important to understand that over the course of the past 30 years, the Western jihadi phenomenon, I think it applies to the US to a certain extent as well, has been following like a pattern of high tide and low tide. We have peak over the course of the last 3 decades. We had 3 peaks. Every time it came by chance in the middle of every decade. So in the mid-1990s, we had peak because of the Algerian civil war and because of the Taliban reaching power in Kabul. This was demonstrated in Europe through attacks in Paris already in the mid-1990s, but also against US interests in Tanzania and Kenya, but also against the USS Cole, and then with 9/11 here. Then, we had the Al-Qaeda in Iraq moment in the mid-2000s, which also developed in attacks against London and Madrid in 2004-2005. Several, of course, attempts that were thwarted at the same time. And then a new decline and a new rebound with ISIS, and this time with a terror campaign that reached, incomparable threshold in Europe. So overall, since 9/11 in Europe, there were 150 attacks carried out by jihadi militants. We're talking about something around 5,000 injured people, around 500 killed. So it's not, again, it has a political impact that is massive, especially if you consider over the same time the development of far-right narrative in European politics, and of course they are complementary to a certain extent. My point is, with ISIS, there is at least 2 changes. The first one is that now Europeans are aware of themselves as, an important contingent, as being part of a global jihadi project. Among the interviews that I've conducted in prisons, I was very much surprised to hear there was a sort of confidence in this person, even though they were locked in. They were in prisons and sometimes sentenced for 10, 15 years, but they were saying, you know, we discovered, just like you, that we were actually quite numerous out there. We discovered there were Belgian, German, of course, British, and even Danish amongst us, and this make up for a new phenomenon. And they were thinking about their involvement not only for themselves, but over the course of the next generation, saying, you know, we will have kids and we will raise them directly within the ideology, and you will have a problem where when we will be not 6,000, but actually 20,000, 25,000. So for them, they were perceiving the ISIS moment in the Middle East as a beta version. One of them actually used the word beta version, saying, you know, we implemented it, we experienced it, we hit the wall, but you know, we'll learn, you know, there will be some lessons learned from that, and we'll see how it works. So the second important lessons from ISIS is that we need to focus on the low tide mode, right? We need to focus actually when ISIS or other jihadi organization look poorly, when they look weakened, and when you have the impression that you know, jihadism as a global phenomenon is actually a past phenomenon. And if you look at how in the West the jihadi threat was perceived over the course of the last 3 decades, it was actually the opposite. We tended to think every time the peak passed that the phenomenon was done. You have to remember, you know, the reaction after the death of bin Laden, for instance, and which came, by the way, at the same time of the American Anwar al-Awlaki when he was killed in a drone attacks in Yemen. The general, you know, speech and commentaries out there in the public debate was that global jihad is done. We you know, bin Laden was taken out, and his organization is going to suffer and reach a new decline. And yet, 2 years after that, ISIS was right there. And if you look, as I tried to do, what happened between the death of bin Laden and the rise of ISIS in the Levant, you understand that the level of Salafi activism in Europe was actually very high at that moment, and was not at all like in decline, but actually quite thriving, even though they were not promoting attacks. They were ideologically motivated. They were carrying out political demonstration in the middle of the street of Paris, of Brussels, of The Hague, of even Copenhagen, but like they were just not praising attacks, even though the very same networks were the first one to send fighters to ISIS when ISIS came up 3 years after that. So if you look at what is happening in low tide mode, you need to change the focus. The focus is not about the security threat. It's about what are they saying and how they reconfigure themselves on an ideological level. And this is the tools that we're lacking the most, because we tend to perceive jihadism as terrorist attacks. And terrorist attacks, it's only a mean. It means in the hand of this person to reach a goal, which is to terrorize like so-called enemy or dedicated enemies. But they also have an entire political engineering where they develop political speech, political discourse, propaganda, of course, and their purpose is to mobilize people in this low tide mode in order to, you know, regenerate clusters when they will need to in the next phase of expansion, the next high tide mode. So what is happening now? You need to see that there is 3 main territories of activism for European jihadism. The first one, the main one, the most obvious one, is like our you know, foreign lands, front lines, such as, you know, Syria and Iraq, Mali at the moment, and other of the likes. Second one will be the prison system in Europe. To give you an understanding, over the 6,000 European that joined ISIS, there is 3/3 of them, like 1/3 is allegedly died there. Another third like came back, and another third is still like in prisons detained in northeast Syria, and most of them being female and underage kids. My point is 1/3 is actually locked in now in prison, and the big difference between European prison system and the US prison system is that the sentences are not the same at all. Like, they are way more shorter. To give you an example, 3 months ago I was in Copenhagen meeting a returnee from Syria. I joined ISIS, spent 2 years in ISIS rank, and there is no doubt about what he was doing there. You know, as he said to me, he said on the record, like he said, I won't tell you exactly what I have done. The only thing that I can say is that if I was there in the middle of a war zone, it was not for distributing chocolate and flowers around me, you know. So it's kind of clear, and I appreciate his honesty to be totally transparent with you. This guy was not even sentenced. He never faced a judge, you know, because he could not be sentenced because his deeds didn't happen in Denmark, but on a foreign land. So this is very different from France and the UK, where we have like tools to prosecute this kind of person. But in Denmark, he was followed, monitored, I imagine, but he was not sentenced. So my point is, we have a situation where we have people who are not sentenced, even though they participate in a jihadi, you know, project abroad and have dirty hands allegedly about it. But we also have people who are actually going out of prison now after being sentenced. And this decade, the 2020s decade, is going to be massive. Like almost all French who participated in the ISIS project will be free within this decade, and actually several dozens of them are already, you know, purged their sentence. So we have the third territory, which is the neighborhoods, and this is very important to understand that, because I imagine it's quite similar. It's a pattern that is quite widespread. If you're looking at where are these persons, where are these people coming from in Europe, I already said that 90% of them were coming from only 7 countries. So namely, it's France, Germany, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. So basically, Northwest European countries. If you look in each of these countries, what you will find is that almost all of them are coming from very specific area. So in France, it will be 15 to 20 towns. In the UK, it will be a dozen. In Germany, the same, a dozen. In Belgium, it's 5, 6, exactly the same as in Netherlands. In Denmark, the same. And if you are zooming in, again, within these towns, you will have very specific neighborhoods. And it's very, it's located within the environment of certain people. And if you trace back that in over 30 years time, you will end up seeing that these very places, these neighborhoods, are the same as the one where veterans from the Afghan Jihad or the Algerian Jihad settled in the 1990s. My point is, there is a history of the phenomenon, but also a geography of it. And if you are looking at this, you understand then that the people going out of jail, they will go back in, being active, specifically in those areas where most of them are coming from. So it is, and I'm reaching, my conclusion here. We have to, when we talk about European jihadism, we have to think about it as the next challenge, not not as bygone days. We need to understand that the challenge lies ahead. Second, we need to look through history to understand common patterns. And what we are seeing now is this cluster phenomenon. And it's documented for Europe. I mean, most of my work is focusing on this, but there is the PhD of Nate Rosenblatt from Oxford University that is focusing on exactly the same thing, but for North African countries. So it seems like it's a universal pattern of jihadism. When they spread starting by a very specific area where they have militants. Second, we need to understand that there is several territories that are connected to each other. So these very specific areas, prisons, and of course the land of jihad abroad. I may add that these specific areas in Europe are not the most marginalized economically speaking, the most marginalized politically speaking, and the more marginalized racially speaking. It is very important to understand that you have super marginalized and segregated areas all over the place in Europe where there was no one who joined ISIS. And reversely, you have quite, the rich neighborhood who like provided 80 or 100 people around there, and I can name like several examples if you want in the conversation. And third, we need to focus on where will be, if ever, the next massive explosion of global jihadism. Will there be a rebound in Syria and Iraq? Will there be like a dramatic decline in sub-Saharan Africa, or will they be directly in Europe? I mean, I'm very interested to hear my colleague about the Balkan situation, because it's actually one of the hot topic in Europe at the moment, especially because of the pressure from the consequences from the war in Ukraine on the Balkan. There is like a cocktail that is quite explosive. So all in all, we should not make the same mistakes as we did so far. This is a pressuring phenomenon. The jihadi phenomenon in Europe now, for the first time, is actually endogenous, and I think that's also a dividing line with the US. It's structural, namely like they are able to develop themselves. And to end on a more positive note, I may say that we should always bear in mind that even though the phenomenon like spread and developed in the past years, we're also talking about very few numbers. So like on a pure political dimension, it should not be difficult for Europe, a continent that basically like experienced everything in its history, to face a phenomenon of like even dozens of thousands of jihadi militants. But we need to use the right focus for that. And if we're not, like, if you're just turning a blind eye on it, we'll have new surprise, and I'm not sure that we can afford the political cost of a new terror campaign in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hugo. Adrian, over to you.
This works. On? Can you hear me? This is on, right? Okay, so first and foremost, I wanted to thank Lorenzo on the program. Okay. Can you hear me? This works? I should project? I don't know. We got it. You're on, you're on.
It's good.
Can you hear me? Okay. This is the only one that works, I guess. Okay, so first and foremost, I wanted to thank you for coming. I wanted to thank Lorenzo for inviting me to publish my research with the program on extremism at GW University. And yeah, it feels great to be in person in one of these events finally. So hopefully we can keep at it instead of doing stuff from screens. Yeah, and so I will discuss a few things about controlled repatriations of foreign terrorist fighters in the Balkans, which are the only countries in Europe that actually have repatriated actively foreign terrorist fighters. I will look into some, or discuss some legal responses and the prosecution and sentencing trends. And finally, I'll provide some considerations for more effective policy responses, tailored to both the dynamic needs but also risks that these individuals that have been repatriated pose. Overall, and so we have some slides, so if we can just go to the first one, just to give you an idea. So between 2018 and 2022, Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia have publicly and voluntarily repatriated about 217 Islamic State-affiliated individuals previously detained by Kurdish-led forces in Syria. Of those repatriated, about 132 were minors, 54 were women, and 31 were men. So I just want to highlight something here, that what I'm talking about is only individuals that have been repatriated as part of this organized campaigns by the governments. There is many more that have spontaneously returned over the years. I'm going to give you some data on that as well. So Bosnia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia are, as I mentioned, the only European countries to have voluntarily and publicly repatriated male Islamic State foreign terrorist fighters previously detained by Kurdish-led forces in Syria. The fact alone that these three small countries that are modestly resourced, and they have modestly resourced criminal justice systems, the fact that they have taken the lead in Europe in repatriating their Islamic State affiliated nationals is a significant development that needs to be highlighted, and one with long-term social and security implications that stretch far beyond the region. Here I wanted to actually interject with my colleague who mentioned that there's about 6,000 Europeans who went to Syria and Iraq. Doesn't include the 1,070. This happens all the time, and I'm not blaming you or anything. Right, so there's a difference between European Union and Europe, first. Second, it's not, I'm not getting defensive on that, please don't misunderstand me, but it's a major blind spot that I keep getting all the time. Not to criticize, but just to point out. There's 1,070 who left, and there's about the total number of people from the Balkans who actually ended up spending some time in Syria and Iraq, it's about 1,500. Because, again, there were many children who were born there. And it's interesting because there's an overlap, because there's a lot of citizens of Balkan countries who actually left from other European countries because they were in the diaspora. And so usually there's like, I mean, to leave out about 1,500 out of another 6 in Europe, when we know that that's a significant number that needs to be, in my view, and I keep saying this for years, integrated in the calculus of whatever we're doing in Europe. Because if we leave them out and we don't consider that as part of the European problem set when it comes to jihadism, then we're creating a major blind spot that is going to contribute to issues in the way policies are developed and programs are funded, because this is a European problem and needs to be taken care of by everyone in Europe, pretty much. But the proactive approach adopted by these countries deserves both praise and greater attention. I sort of mentioned why we need to focus on the attention, but praise also because proactive repatriation as an approach is in line with various national security, what a lot of security experts are highlighting that is the right thing to do. Because it's the most viable thing long-term from a security standpoint. The number of individuals who have returned so far in the Balkans over the years, about 560. Only 217 of them have been repatriated. Okay, so the number of returnees currently that are physically in the Balkans is over twice that number, and it represents the highest concentration of returned foreign terrorist fighters and family members in the European continent. So the level of concentration there is much higher than you would see in France, you'd see in Germany, you would see in the UK, Belgium, Sweden, and all the countries that you mentioned in northwestern part of the European continent. Attention also needs to be paid to this phenomenon and what's going on in the Balkans, also because it provides us a valuable window into what happens when you repatriate, actually actively repatriate foreign terrorist fighters. And you can learn from what's going on in the Balkans, because there's good things that are happening there, there's things that can be done in a different way, but it's a lab right now, because it's the only country that has actually repatriated foreign terrorist fighters that were engaged with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. In terms of numbers by country, I'll give you a little bit of quick overview of what's going on. So far, there have been at least 11 cases of reported Islamic State-affiliated adult male individuals repatriated to North Macedonia from Syria as part of two repatriation operations that were supported by the US military. Actually, North Macedonia became the first European country to publicly transfer ISIS fighters from Syria. This was in August of 2018. Kosovo has so far repatriated the highest number, which is not a huge difference from North Macedonia, but 12, there's 12 cases of reported repatriations as part of 3 transfer operations, again supported by the United States. And again, I wanted to also emphasize something. There has been other individuals formerly affiliated with the Islamic State who have been deported by third countries, namely Turkey. But I'm not including them here, right? So I'm only focusing on the individuals that have been actively repatriated by the countries, not deported into the countries, or individuals who came or returned spontaneously over the years. Okay, just highlighting that as well. Bosnia so far has, there's about 8 cases that they have repatriated as part of 2 transfer operations. And then there's Albania, but Albania has not repatriated male individuals. They've only repatriated women and children so far. I will not delve too much into the intricacies of the existing legislations, but I'll mention that in line with the United Nations Resolution 2178 on foreign terrorist fighters, all the countries of the Balkans changed their laws or amended their national legislation to criminalize traveling to Syria and Iraq. This happened between 2014 and 15, largely speaking. And the sentences foreseen for these crimes in the local legislations have ranged from 3 years at a minimum to 10 years, give or take. And then for those individuals who were also involved in recruiting or financing, that the sentences have been higher, up to 20 years. So I can go into details if you want during the Q&A, but I want to take too much time because I have a lot of data. So, and then I'll go into the sentencing trends. So of the 31 let me see, where are we? Okay, great. Of the 31 repatriated Islamic State affiliated adult male individuals, courts in Bosnia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia have issued guilty verdicts against 24 of them on charges related to joining the Islamic State. Indictments were issued against 4 other individuals. Investigations are ongoing, or were ongoing at the time I was writing the report, in 2 cases. Charges were dropped against 1 individual who returned as an adult but left as a juvenile, and he went there with his parents. Courts in Bosnia have issued guilty verdicts to all 8 repatriated individuals. 4 of them negotiated plea agreements with the prosecution. And I should mention also that Kosovo has the same experience where they've offered these plea agreements, and a high number of these individuals in Kosovo have accepted those plea agreements with the prosecution. The average prison sentence handed down in Bosnian courts has been 3.4 years, ranging from a minimum of 1 year to a maximum of 6 years. There's been 2 convicted foreign terrorist fighters who have been released so far, and another will be released by the end of 2022. Another 4 will be released between 2023 and 2025. Courts in Kosovo have issued guilty verdicts to at least 10 repatriated adult foreign terrorist fighters. At least 7 of them, as I mentioned, entered the guilty pleas in exchange for leniency. The average prison sentence in Kosovo has been 4 years, from 3 to 6 years, from a minimum of 3 to a max of 6. 3 convicted foreign terrorist fighters have been released, and another one is set to be released early next year. One of them was released in 2021 after spending only 18 months of a 4-year prison sentence. And I'll explain why later on if you want. The other 6 are set to be released between 2024 and 2025. Again, Kosovo has a different experience also when it comes to repatriated women. Out of 33 women that have been repatriated, 29 pleaded guilty to joining the Islamic State after they were prosecuted. And unlike male foreign terrorist fighters who actually were charged with offenses under the same article of the criminal code, these women almost exclusively received 2-year suspended sentences. So there's also a different way of applying exactly the laws, but based on gender. So this is something that needs to be discussed a little bit more, in my view. Courts in North Macedonia have issued guilty verdicts to 7 repatriated adults, who entered guilty pleas also in exchange for leniency. Average prison sentence has been 6.4 in the case of North Macedonia, from a minimum of 6 years to a maximum of 9 years. So you can see that it's a little higher in North Macedonia compared to the other countries. The other 4 Islamic State affiliated adult male individuals that were repatriated they were repatriated a year ago, were indicted at the time I was writing the report. 5 of the repatriated FTFs are set to be released by mid-2024. As you can see, most of them will be released in the next 3 years. Okay? Some observations and conclusions. Firstly, by deciding to proactively repatriate their nationals from Syria, these countries have acknowledged their duties and responsibilities and have taken concrete steps to meet their responsibilities and duties, as I mentioned, despite political resistance, objective difficulties, and security concerns. I mean, the countries on the Balkans have exactly the same concerns as elsewhere in Europe, but they have made a different decision to repatriate. I think this needs to be highlighted because it's a very good thing, in my view, that they have taken this proactive stance. Controlled removal, why am I saying that? Because controlled removal of foreign terrorist fighters and foreign nationals in general from overcrowded prisons and IDP camps in Syria, first and foremost, reduces the risk of ISIS's re-emergence in Syria and Iraq. Second, allows for a more effective management of security risks associated with these individuals. And third, provides a valuable opportunity for everyone, policymakers, researchers, to study the attitudes and behaviors of these individuals formerly or even currently associated with the Islamic State, in order for us to tailor more effective policy responses to their dynamic needs and the risks associated with them. On average, repatriated Islamic State foreign terrorist fighters have received lengthier prison sentences compared to other jihadist terrorism convicts in their respective countries in the Western Balkans. So there's already been an upward trend when it comes to sentencing. But the decisions in some cases, for example, of Kosovar courts to credit the time spent in Kurdish custody toward the imposed prison sentence, have significantly reduced the time these individuals end up spending in incarceration after their repatriation, allowing them to exit the prison system much sooner. This unusual practice sets a precedent that may allow foreign terrorist fighters that will be repatriated later on to Kosovo to serve even shorter sentences or potentially avoid serving any time in Kosovo prison systems. Because if you're calculating the time and you're deducting the time spent in Kurdish custody, for example, after 2 years, if you repatriate them, well, maybe they would have already served the totality, the entire sentence in Kurdish custody. Despite the relative increase in length, convictions handed down to repatriated FTFs by Bosnian and Kosovar criminal justice systems continue to border on the minimum foreseen by the law, prison term. It is not readily apparent from the cases I've seen and the court documents that I've read what mitigating circumstances may have informed such court decisions other than the guilty pleas that they have entered in the case of most defendants. Court documents, and this is, I think I want to highlight this because it goes hand in hand with what my colleague was just saying. Court documents in various cases confirm that whether these foreign terrorist fighters traveled with other jihadist militants and or family members, or were assisted by transnational mobilization and facilitation cells, they did not appear to have acted on impulse or in isolation. Rather, from what I've seen, foreign terrorist fighters acted with premeditation and as part of a group of like-minded individuals or in coordination with jihadist networks operating between the Western Balkans and Syria, and sometimes linked to elements of Western Balkans diaspora in Europe, in the rest of Europe. The prison sentences are also, if we compare them, they're lower to what's being handed down in other European countries, European Union countries. According to Europol 2021 report, in 2020, the average prison sentence for jihadist terrorism-related offenses in European Union was about 9 years. By comparison, the average sentence for criminal offenses related to Islamic State in the United States in September was, in September of this year, 2022, stood at 13.3 years, according to research that GWU does. So you can see the huge difference between those numbers. Another implication of the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters has been the increase in the population of terrorism convicts in Western Balkans prison system. It is a modestly resourced prison system, and that needs to be highlighted. While the number of those repatriated in relative terms is small, so we're only talking about 31 individuals, by virtue of their length of affiliation with Islamic State, the know-how, the networks that they have connections to, the battlefield experience, the creed that was mentioned earlier, they are very significant within, in some cases they actually rule that space, you can tell. And unfortunately, there's a few of those who even have cell phones in prisons, and they post stuff online pretty much continuously. So unfortunately, that is not exactly ideal, and allowing them to proselytize and radicalize not only inside but also actively from inside prisons to outside. It's something that needs to be looked into. So more resources should be invested in designing and implementing effective and evidence-based systems of risk assessments to handle these inmates that should in turn then inform the overall management strategy to be adopted in prison facilities where repatriated foreign terrorist fighters are housed. The issue of potential inmate radicalization is compounded by the uneven progress made towards putting in place rehabilitation and reintegration programs within the prison system or the correctional system. So when lenient sentences for terrorism offenders are further reduced, as I mentioned, for a number of reasons, by early and conditional releases in the absence of adequately staffed, trained, and funded probation services, the security risks, including the risk of recidivism, automatically will inevitably increase. This risk could be gradually mitigated by significantly boosting resources, staffing, capacity building, so training, support for prison-based disengagement programs, and post-incarceration monitoring and rehabilitation and integration services across the region. So in conclusion, based on the sentences handed down so far, pending any potential additional sentences that may be handed down while they are serving the sentences. Most repatriated Islamic State affiliated male individuals will be released between 2023 and 2025. In preparation for their re-entry in society and in anticipation of additional potential repatriation operations that may happen, because there's hundreds more still in prisons and IDP camps in northern Syria, the authorities would do well to reassess and adjust sentencing ranges and conditional release practices, and consider implementing additional prison-based and post-incarceration risk assessment and management tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Lorenzo, over to you.
Thank you very much. And really, it is a pleasure to see a lot of old and new friends in person. So thank you all for coming. I want to try to sort of pull together some of the threads that came across in the three presentations. Before doing that, let me open. No, it's technology missed it. Okay, should be better. Right. Before trying to put my concluding remarks to bring together these three excellent presentations, I just wanted to remind everybody that the papers, the reports were mentioned today are part of this project that we launched at the beginning of the year called Nexus, and that Andrew, who left, together with Haroro Ingram, has been curating very effectively. And the idea behind Nexus is to follow the developments of global jihadism in a phase of relative decline, although that's very much depending on what part of the world we're looking at, but for sure in a phase of diminished interest in the West when it comes to jihadism, for reasons that are partially understandable, partially, I think, in my opinion, mistaken. The idea is to follow the developments globally, the competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda in different locales, and to do so by relying on the knowledge, the expertise of mostly local experts. So really go beyond the Beltway and try to get people who have the fieldwork experience, the knowledge on the ground of what is going on. So we have done, thanks to Andrew, now came back to get his final praise for how he's been curating the series that we put out on Afghanistan, the developments in Afghanistan. Very important, of course. We're going to have more on Africa coming out in the next few months, and of course that's a very important area if we think of decline when it comes to jihadism in the West. In sub-Saharan Africa, we definitely have to think about an opposite dynamic, but we wanted to do something about the West. This is what the program also has been doing for a long time, looking at dynamics of extremism in the US and in Europe. So we put out these papers. Adrian and Hugo contributed two. Levi West contributed one on Australia, which is also a very interesting case study. And then we are putting out two short reports, one authored by myself and Seamus and Bennett Clifford on ISIS in America, sort of updating current trends. And one final on attacks, a really very quantitative report in which we look at terrorist attacks from 2014, declaration of the caliphate, until now in the West, and trying to see certain dynamic. The picture that comes out of all these reports is the picture that you've heard of a jihadism that is somewhat in decline, but definitely not gone, definitely not vanished, and arguably in a phase of transition. The empirics data, we try to always rely on empirics when we have these conversations, paint this picture fairly clearly. If we look at three critical data points, arrests, foreign fighters, and attacks, the picture is fairly clear. If you look at number of individuals arrested for jihadist activities, whether in the US or in Europe in 2014, 15, 16, compared to the last 3 years, we're talking about a substantial decline. In Europe, that would be from the 600 individuals give or take, in 2015 and 2016 to around 150 to 100 individuals over the last 2 or 3 years. So 1/3, give or take. Foreign fighters, the decline is even more dramatic. If we talk about the 6,000 plus 1,500 of Europe of 2014, 15, 16, we're down to the single digits when it comes to foreign fighters from both Europe and the United States over the last 2 or 3 years. It's slightly different when it comes to attacks. We're going to have a report out today, tomorrow, sometime today, on attacks, in which we look at the number of attacks. And the decline is not as steep as one would think. There's definitely less attention in the public for attacks. 5 years ago, a random attack would get to the front page in the New York Times. Today, it's often somewhat overlooked. But the number of attacks has declined, but not substantially. What has declined substantially is the lethality of the attacks, the number of people who get killed in those attacks. And I would argue that's for two main reasons. The first is the substantially diminished sophistication of the perpetrators of those attacks, the fact that none of the individuals who have carried out attacks in Europe or the United States over the last few years had any meaningful operational connection to ISIS, Al-Qaeda or other groups, while in the past they did. The numbers are skewed because, for example, the November 2015 attacks in Paris, which were very centrally orchestrated by ISIS, killed a substantial number of people. The attacks of the last 3-4 years are, for the most part, attacks carried out by one lone perpetrator, often with a knife, and so in a very unsophisticated way. The second reason I would argue is the substantially better role played by law enforcement and intelligence agencies throughout, and I think that's more of a European issue. I think when it comes to the US, the FBI has been fairly steady in terms of resources and legal tools available to thwart attacks. In Europe, particularly in maybe the countries in Europe that have not historically experienced the same terrorist threat, and therefore that did not have, back in 2015-16, the same legal tools that allowed investigators to operate more effectively. So not necessarily a French, an Italian, or a British problem. Those are countries that have dealt with terrorism for a long time. But other countries, Scandinavian ones, for example, did not have the right tools. And what we have seen is, over the last few years, a substantial increase of thwarted attacks throughout Europe. And those thwarted attacks were, for the most part, those attacks that included a relatively large number of perpetrators and a connection to the Middle East. So a few plots, for example, one fairly recently in Germany, in which 5 or 6 individuals operating in different cities, communicating with one another, and then communicating with ISIS handlers in Syria were arrested. Those, of course, are the tools which are easier to thwart if one has the right legal tools compared to the self-started, lone actor kind of attacks. But generally speaking, as I said, the picture is very clearly one of decline, and the joy of speaking last is that Hugo really got it all right and stole what I wanted to say. That's the reason why you're a fellow with us, because we agree. Is this idea of low tide and high tide, ebbs and flows, ups and downs. And I think if one looks at the history of jihadism in the West, that is the way it has to be seen. There's two elements that sort of characterize jihadism in the West. One is internal, one is external. One is the presence of a jihadist scene, of milieus, of networks, of individuals that espouse jihadist ideologies. Those individuals, those networks have always existed since I will go even further to the 80s, the late 80s, throughout the West. But the second element that determines the size and the direction, and if you will, even the aggressiveness of the first element, is events that take place outside of the West. It's geopolitical events. It's the war in Afghanistan, or it's the war in Bosnia and in Algeria in the 90s. It's 9/11. And of course, in 2011, 2012 is the beginning of the Syrian conflict. So moments of peak and moments of decline. We're clearly in a moment of decline, of low tide, as you put it. And I think it is the moment, and this is one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, to assess what has happened over the last few years, assess where the movement is going, because I do share the view that Hugo described of a movement that exists and it just changes direction, changes size, but it's been with us for the last 40 years, and see what can be done better. And I think to some degree there's also an intention of providing a recommendation to not let the guard down because the phenomenon is not dissipated. I don't necessarily see most governments in Europe thinking that, but I think in the US the attention has gone down significantly. And I think that's probably a bit of an incentive to look more at jihadism should be there. So obviously the issues that were discussed, and again trying to bring together some of the presentations from the more technical ones, but crucially important, the issue of prisons. All of you have described them. I think we've all sort of experienced analysts and speakers. If I had a dime for every conference in which we talked about the issue of prisons and prison management and how to do it, right, I think the center would all be operating at a much higher level. The reality is that nobody has the solution. There are challenges that exist in each country. The challenges might be bigger in, as you call them, modestly resourced countries with a high number of prisoners like those in the Balkans, but even in a country like the US, where the resources should be higher, and which the number of detainees is not as big as in other countries, we still have some of the problems as you described them. So prisons being an incubator for radicalization, being a place in which people reinforce their commitment, network with other people, I think that's an issue that never gets old, unfortunately. The second factor, which oddly was less mentioned here because it's often another one that is understandably correctly always mentioned, is the online component. I think we're all in agreement that jihadism and so let's say radicalization often takes place with a combination of offline and online components. And we've always been believers of the program that the offline component is often overlooked. There's a tendency to look just at the online piece of it while overlooking the offline. Having said so, the online component is crucially important, and what we are seeing now is, of course, a better system created thanks to the partnership between governments and the industry to monitor and crack down on online activities, but that limits itself only to certain platforms. And there's a permanent, a continuous mutation and migration to new platforms, which are at times very difficult, with high level of encryptions, and that are often very difficult to track for authorities. The third element is, I think Hugo brought it up very nicely, is the difficulty of still at this stage understanding exactly the radicalization process. Still coming up with generally shared grand theory of radicalization as to why it takes place. I think you shattered a lot of the assumptions that some have about, for example, the close connection between radicalization and socioeconomic deprivation, or the fact that that radicalization takes place in geographical hubs. When you were speaking, Adrian said it's the same thing in the Balkans. We were talking and said it's exactly the same dynamic. It might be a bit different in the United States. I think in the States we never seen the same hubs, with a few exceptions, but we never seen the same hubs. And while the dynamic of the isolated individual that radicalizes entirely online exists in Europe, but is a bit of a minority case. It's not very common. It is the majority of the cases in the United States. So here's a big difference between Europe and the US. Which leads to a very European debate, which is not very big in the United States, on the importance of ideologies and groups that foster and spread ideologies that are not necessarily directly violent, but that can lead to violence. We're talking about certain interpretation of Salafism or the activities of a group like Tablighi Jamaat or Hizb ut-Tahrir or even the Muslim Brotherhood. And the European experience has been over the last few years that these groups are, and of course the analysis should be very nuanced there, but that at times these groups can produce a fertile environment in which jihadist groups operate. Again, in the United States, we don't really have this sort of similar dynamics of groups that incubate radicalization. The fourth and last point, mindful of time, and I think again it came up in some of your presentations, is the relationship between jihadism and right-wing extremism. And by relationship, I mean the different aspects of that. I mean, there's clearly over the last 3-4 years, and I think that is long overdue. At the program, we've been trying to talk about right-wing extremism when it was not popular, so going back to when we started back in 2014, about the growth of right-wing extremism throughout the West, although with different dynamics between Europe and the United States. The big challenge of resource allocation between jihadism and right-wing extremism, this at times idea that it's an either-or proposition, which one is the biggest, and we almost try to make them compete, and I don't think that's the right approach. Of course, the dynamics of reciprocal radicalization between jihadism and right-wing extremism, how the two poisonous ideologies feed off one another, how right-wing extremism would point at jihadism and even non-violent Islamism as proof of its theories, and at the same time how jihadists and Islamists would do the same about extreme right ideologies. Anti-Semitism being the glue between the two ideologies, the similarities between extreme right and Islamist jihadist ideologies are at times quite striking. When you strip them off certain aspects, you go to the bare bones of the two ideologies, you find quite a few similarities. And I think the final point is indeed about what Hugo was saying about getting this right, and for governments to keep their guard up when it comes to jihadism, because there's no better tool, there's no better factor that can lead to polarization in society than another growth in jihadism, which would lead to a growth in extreme right-wing ideology and so on and so forth. So I think maintaining the attention on this topic is crucially important for aspects that go well beyond the security, but include the political one. As I said, I was supposed to go short, I didn't, but Andrew, if you can bring it together with some questions from the audience.
Great, thank you, Lorenzo. I'd hope these would work, but apparently not. I'm going to turn it to the audience for questions first. We are short on time, so does anybody have any questions to kick us off? We'll get to you. Yes, sir.
I am Irfan Said in the State Department. First of all, thank you, POE, for always getting the best researchers and the best data. You have your fingers in the pulse of all things CT and CVE, so thank you. And of course, great round of thanks to the panelists, great presentations. You go with no notes at all, quite impressive. But I wanted to make a comment and a question. First in the comment, thank you on mentioning REMV. It is one of the things that we are tracking very closely at the State Department, the transnational linkages. And I think when you talk about the similarities of where they are and where they're growing is very important. You mentioned the 11 countries. I think every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so it's no accident that a lot of the height of REMV that we're looking at, those same 11 countries are focus areas. But my question is more about repatriation and trying to go to the next level. The State Department is taking on a renewed effort to repatriate all of the citizens in Northeast Syria. We've talked about this a lot. To close out those camps, Al-Hol, Anisa, Al-Roj in particular, bring people home. I think a lot of what you discussed today is really the fear that countries have. Recidivism, low prison rates, increased radicalization in prison, even if they do come to prison when they come back home. So my question is, what more can we do to increase that political will in those countries to allow them to say, yes, it is better to bring them home than it is to leave them there?
Frankly speaking, it's a very tough question because, as I mentioned earlier, it's the countries that have the most experience and the most resources that are kind of very reluctant to do it. And there is political reasons behind it. We're seeing it manifested across the board in Europe right now. So there's a cost, basically, that they politically do not look inclined to be willing to pay. In the Balkans, as I mentioned, this is why they deserve particular praise, because they have stepped up to the plate and they have, again, there's more that needs to be done. But in relative terms, I mean, it's significant what they're doing, and I think we can learn.
What was the thinking? So why did they make it? How did they explain the decision?
So there's a couple of components that I'm going to be very, very direct and honest. First and foremost, they do consider foreign fighters to be their own. And they say it. You know, they say, yeah, this is our folks, we need to bring them home. In Europe, my experience, in the rest of Europe, there's less of that narrative. In my experience, and because there is other considerations in terms of, I mean, you've seen this when they strip them of their nationality, right? If they're dual nationals, and it has happened even in other cases involving, there was another high-profile case involving Canada and another country. Yep, here too. So I think that is a little bit of what's going on. I mean, what can be done to increase the willingness? It's a very good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for that because, I mean, State Department has been, beating that drum for a very long time to no avail, unfortunately. I'm not seeing any movement in France, for example. I mean, Hugo can speak about that, but yeah, I don't know.
Thank you very much for your question. I share your comment about the program on extremism. You know, that's fascinating because that's something that doesn't exist in France, for instance, where we have this debate here, and the data and the works and the studies that you provide with the department is something that doesn't exist as such in Europe, which is incredible when all the stakes are there. On the point that you raised, I think one of the things is the political cost of such a decision of bringing them back home. To give you an example, there were several polls in French newspapers, and it's about 80 to 82% of French who are against repatriation, which means that you have to fight for your own. You have to do a persuasion work here, just not to lose some political capital in French politics. Second off, on a more practical level, I think it's very difficult because if you look at the situation at the moment, there is no such thing as a good decision, and that's the dead end where the debate ends all the time. So on the one hand, the cost of letting these persons, like these people there, is very high. I'm talking about we're talking about kids and that are raised in camp, which are no different than small caliphate, basically. So being under ISIS in Raqqa or in Al-Hol camp, as it is at the moment, is pretty much the same for these kids when it comes to their education, their worldviews, and so on and so forth. Second off, there is of course the risk of ISIS taking them back because of re-emergence in the area. And third off, there is the risk of them just vanishing, and which is maybe one of the worst. I think we can add to that as well the cost of them falling in the hands of the Syrian regime, where the Assad regime has been very famous for the past 20 years for instrumentalizing and weaponizing jihadi volunteers from the West, sometimes losing one on the road on the way back home, or sometimes sending them to Iraq to weaken the American position there. So they have a long story of instrumentalizing these volunteers. So this is also a high risk in a place that is not politically settled, which is Northeast Syria. So why is it so difficult to bring them back home? So political costs, but also security costs. When you see how difficult it is to manage one person, one of these returnees from Syria and Iraq within the French prison system or the UK or the British prison system, then you understand that there is a pressure on that front too. So we're talking about overcrowded prison system. We're talking about highly vulnerable population within it. And some poor relation within returnees from Syria and Iraq and criminals are very much in the advantage of ISIS returnees. So I think one of the key solutions that could be debated, and that is not debate as such, will be to Europeanize the solution, namely to decide that we're facing something that could be a small Nuremberg trial, where we decide to bring them all back home, to have to apply specific European jurisdiction to them, and legal treatment, but within the rule of law and within and sharing based on all the European principles of justice, but to make it European, so it's not relying at the end of the day on the French legal system or the British one, but on something that will be a true European initiative. And we kind of see that Europe is now taking that road down, especially regarding Russia now. We are developing, common politics, common sanctions, we're now collectively buying weapons, and so this is the direction that is taken for bigger issues such as the war in Ukraine. So why not try to find a legal response that will be truly European and that will mitigate the risk that I've mentioned.
Thank you for your question. Do we have any others? Yes, sir.
This question about recidivism. I always thought that the recidivism numbers are pretty low of convicted terrorists. In the Netherlands, we have some years usually later convicted for financing. I think that's the only case so far. You mentioned 1/3 got arrested 3 times more. Was that after the terrorism? Well, that was before. So, is it, what are the facts about recidivism?
Yep. So one of the facts is that we don't know in the U.S. So there's not good published data about it, I would say. There's open source data. Thomas Renard has done some great work, but it's only with cases that have that terrorism charge. Sorry, all these mics. And so the issue is, back in 2014 to 2016, the FBI specifically made a decision in the United States to try to close the gap and arrest people who they were suspected of terrorism, even without the terrorism enhanced charge. So if they had, for example, possession of child pornography, or a lot of the charges were lying to a federal agent. So they don't have the terrorism charge attached to their sentence. So there's a huge group of people in the United States who, as academics, we would call terrorists, but we're not charged with that. So the recidivism rates that you can get from just court records alone are very difficult to obtain. It is a low rate when you only look at the terrorism charges, but the issue with those is that they have incredible supervision. So there's a whole thing that happened in 2016 in our correction system called the Corrections Intelligence Program, where people in the Bureau of Prisons partnered with JTTF. So all those that have the terrorism charges get just incredible monitoring once they're released. The problem is the number of individuals who don't have those terrorism charges, so we don't know the actual base rate of that. And there's no data to suggest what it is. My other issue, I would say, is that even if it is a low rate, and this is the argument that I make, right? Think of all of the money we invest in counter insider threat, right, or counterintelligence. That's also a low base rate phenomenon, but it has incredible adverse impacts on organizations and our national security. So why we're not investing that same amount on something that would also have an outsized impact on our society in America is incredible to me. So it's not about the number of recidivism, it's about the consequence if one does recidivate. And so when I look at the cases and the individuals and the plots that have been thwarted, it's incredible to me that we're not resourcing this more proactively as a country, because it would change the way we are in America if any of those attacks had been carried out. So that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but it's an accurate and realistic one.
Thank you for your question. I think we have time for just one more. We're a little over, but yeah, in the back, please.
It's very quick. Thank you all the panelists. It's for Dr. Ligon. Have you conducted, or has anyone conducted any PCLRs for the risk assessments?
You're gonna tell me what a PCLR is?
Oh, sorry. The psychopathy checklist revised. I didn't know if that's part of the risk assessments that they're doing.
Yeah, so there's some psychopathy items on the PICRA, and that's actually a lot of what it picks up, to be candid. It's for those very violent criminals. The problem is, to me, as a terrorism researcher, you know, when you have like a person who's very quiet and not violent in prison, model prisoner, and didn't have a lot of those risk factors or psychopathy, that they are willing to, they're devoted actors, they're willing to do incredible damage based on their ideology, they're not gonna show on a psychopathy checklist either. There's some promising instruments, I think, in Europe actually, that we should be piloting here in the US, but there's no sort of recognized extremism specific instrument for risk assessment in the United States that's been adopted. And part of that is this, there's not the data that we need to be able to demonstrate that their validity of them to actually have that wide scale adoption.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, we're out of time. Certainly much to think about, too short for 90 minutes for the scope of this discussion, but I want to thank you all, and thank you all for being here. We'll make this recording available on the website page, so if you want to go back and see anything that we discussed here, please do check that out. Please also check out Nexus as well. If you're a student and you want to think about some directions for your future research, Nexus has some answers for you. If you're a member of the press and you want to help us get some of the topics we've discussed today out to the general public, we publish under a Creative Commons license, so please do that. If you're a researcher and you have fieldwork that you're itching to push out, please consider us as a platform. We're always here, we're always listening. And if you're a practitioner and there are things that we didn't answer today or topics that you want to see answered in the future, please reach out to us and we'll do our best to meet those needs. With that, we're done for today, and thank you to our panelists. I hope you join me as well today.